The morning sun painted golden streaks across the moving truck as the new family pulled up to their two-story brick house in the peaceful Oak Grove neighborhood. The air was filled with the sweet scent of blooming summer flowers, and birds chirped cheerfully in the towering maple trees that lined the street. "Home, sweet home," whispered Mrs. Lee to herself as she watched her three kids tumble out of their car, their eyes wide with excitement. Her husband, the newly appointed police chief, was already directing the movers with boxes, his police badge tucked away in his pocket. They decided to keep his new position quiet for a while, wanting to settle into the neighborhood like any other family. The twins, both 12, couldn't contain their excitement as they raced up the concrete driveway, their sneakers slapping against the surface. "I call dibs on the room with the big window," shouted one, while their younger brother, just 8 years old, tried his best to keep up with his longer-legged siblings. Mrs. Lee couldn't help but smile as she watched her children explore their new home. After 15 years of her husband working his way up through the police force, countless late nights, and endless dedication, they'd finally achieved their dream. Being the city's first Asian American police chief was a huge milestone. But right now, he was just dad, helping his kids carry boxes of toys and books into their new rooms. The neighborhood seemed picture perfect. Neat lawns stretched out in every direction, with colorful flower beds and well-maintained hedges. Children's bikes leaned against garage doors, and a few neighbors peeked curiously through their windows at the new arrivals. An ice cream truck's melody drifted faintly in the distance, making their younger son bounce with excitement. As they unloaded their belongings, Mrs. Lee noticed their next-door neighbor watching intently from behind her living room curtain. The woman's face held an expression that made Mrs. Lee's stomach twist slightly, but she pushed the feeling aside. After all, they'd dealt with curious neighbors before, and things had always worked out fine in the end. The twins had already claimed their rooms upstairs and were busy planning where to put their basketball hoop in the driveway. Their father had promised they could set it up that weekend, and they couldn't wait to break it in. Their little brother was exploring the backyard, fascinated by a family of rabbits that had made their home under the deck. As the afternoon wore on, the moving truck finally pulled away, leaving the family surrounded by towers of boxes in their new home. The kitchen was a maze of packed dishes and appliances, and someone had mysteriously labeled a box "random stuff," which would surely be fun to sort through later. "Who wants pizza?" Chief Lee called out, holding up his phone with a grin. The kids cheered in response, temporarily abandoning their room organizing efforts. As they gathered in the kitchen, sitting on boxes because they hadn't unpacked the chairs yet, there was a feeling of new beginnings in the air. Sure, there would be challenges ahead, but right now, they were just a happy family starting their next big adventure. Little did they know that their next-door neighbor was already making phone calls about her new neighbors, and their peaceful first day was just the calm before an unexpected storm. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the moving truck as the new family pulled up to their two-story brick house in the peaceful Oak Grove neighborhood. The air was filled with the sweet scent of blooming summer flowers, and birds chirped cheerfully in the towering maple trees that lined the street. "Home, sweet home," whispered Mrs. Lee to herself as she watched her three kids tumble out of their car, their eyes wide with excitement. Her husband, the newly appointed police chief, was already directing the movers with boxes, his police badge tucked away in his pocket. They decided to keep his new position quiet for a while, wanting to settle into the neighborhood like any other family. The twins, both 12, couldn't contain their excitement as they raced up the concrete driveway, their sneakers slapping against the surface. "I call dibs on the room with the big window," shouted one, while their younger brother, just 8 years old, tried his best to keep up with his longer-legged siblings. Mrs. Lee couldn't help but smile as she watched her children explore their new home. After 15 years of her husband working his way up through the police force, countless late nights, and endless dedication, they'd finally achieved their dream. Being the city's first Asian American police chief was a huge milestone. But right now, he was just dad, helping his kids carry boxes of toys and books into their new rooms. The neighborhood seemed picture perfect. Neat lawns stretched out in every direction, with colorful flower beds and well-maintained hedges. Children's bikes leaned against garage doors, and a few neighbors peeked curiously through their windows at the new arrivals. An ice cream truck's melody drifted faintly in the distance, making their younger son bounce with excitement. As they unloaded their belongings, Mrs. Lee noticed their next-door neighbor watching intently from behind her living room curtain. The woman's face held an expression that made Mrs. Lee's stomach twist slightly, but she pushed the feeling aside. After all, they'd dealt with curious neighbors before, and things had always worked out fine in the end. The twins had already claimed their rooms upstairs and were busy planning where to put their basketball hoop in the driveway. Their father had promised they could set it up that weekend, and they couldn't wait to break it in. Their little brother was exploring the backyard, fascinated by a family of rabbits that had made their home under the deck. As the afternoon wore on, the moving truck finally pulled away, leaving the family surrounded by towers of boxes in their new home. The kitchen was a maze of packed dishes and appliances, and someone had mysteriously labeled a box "random stuff," which would surely be fun to sort through later. "Who wants pizza?" Chief Lee called out, holding up his phone with a grin. The kids cheered in response, temporarily abandoning their room organizing efforts. As they gathered in the kitchen, sitting on boxes because they hadn't unpacked the chairs yet, there was a feeling of new beginnings in the air. Sure, there would be challenges ahead, but right now, they were just a happy family starting their next big adventure. Little did they know that their next-door neighbor was already making phone calls about her new neighbors, and their peaceful first day was just the calm before an unexpected storm. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the moving truck as the new family pulled up to their two-story brick house in the peaceful Oak Grove neighborhood. The air was filled with the sweet scent of blooming summer flowers, and birds chirped cheerfully in the towering maple trees that lined the street. "Home, sweet home," whispered Mrs. Lee to herself as she watched her 3 kids tumble out of their car, their eyes wide with excitement. Her husband, the newly appointed police chief, was already directing the movers with boxes, his police badge tucked away in his pocket. They decided to keep his new position quiet for a while, wanting to settle into the neighborhood like any other family. The twins, both 12, couldn't contain their excitement as they raced up the concrete driveway, their sneakers slapping against the surface. "I call dibs on the room with the big window," shouted one, while their younger brother, just 8 years old, tried his best to keep up with his longer-legged siblings. Mrs. Lee couldn't help but smile as she watched her children explore their new home. After 15 years of her husband working his way up through the police force, countless late nights, and endless dedication, they'd finally achieved their dream. Being the city's first Asian American police chief was a huge milestone, but right now, he was just Dad, helping his kids carry boxes of toys and books into their new rooms. The neighborhood seemed picture perfect. Neat lawns stretched out in every direction, with colorful flower beds and well-maintained hedges. Children's bikes leaned against garage doors, and a few neighbors peeked curiously through their windows at the new arrivals. An ice cream truck's melody drifted faintly in the distance, making their younger son bounce with excitement. As they unloaded their belongings, Mrs. Lee noticed their next-door neighbor watching intently from behind her living room curtain. The woman's face held an expression that made Mrs. Lee's stomach twist slightly, but she pushed the feeling aside. After all, they'd dealt with curious neighbors before, and things had always worked out fine in the end. The twins had already claimed their rooms upstairs and were busy planning where to put their basketball hoop in the driveway. Their father had promised they could set it up that weekend, and they couldn't wait to break it in. Their little brother was exploring the backyard, fascinated by a family of rabbits that had made their home under the deck. As the afternoon wore on, the moving truck finally pulled away, leaving the family surrounded by towers of boxes in their new home. The kitchen was a maze of packed dishes and appliances, and someone had mysteriously labeled a box "random stuff," which would surely be fun to sort through later. "Who wants pizza?" Chief Lee called out, holding up his phone with a grin. The kids cheered in response, temporarily abandoning their room organizing efforts. As they gathered in the kitchen, sitting on boxes because they hadn't unpacked the chairs yet, there was a feeling of new beginnings in the air. Sure, there would be challenges ahead, but right now, they were just a happy family starting their next big adventure. Little did they know that their next-door neighbor was already making phone calls about her new neighbors, and their peaceful first day was just the calm before an unexpected storm. The next morning dawned bright and early, bringing with it an unexpected scene on the Lee family's front lawn. A small group of reporters had gathered, their news vans parked along the street. Someone had posted a video of yesterday's events on social media, and it had spread like wildfire overnight. "Chief," called out one reporter as he stepped out to get his morning paper. "Can you comment on the incident that occurred yesterday?" Before he could respond, Mrs. Wu emerged from her house across the street. She stood on her porch for a moment, clutching her morning coffee, looking uncertain. The reporters swung their cameras toward her, sensing another story angle. The chief watched as Mrs. Wu took a deep breath and, to everyone's surprise, walked straight across the street toward him. The cameras followed her every move. "I have something to say," she announced, her voice shaking slightly. She turned to face the cameras directly. "And I want everyone to hear it." The chief's wife appeared at the door, and their children peeked out from behind her, curious about the commotion. The reporters pressed closer, microphones extended. "Yesterday," Mrs. Wu began, her knuckles white around her coffee cup, "I did something terrible. I called the police on children who were simply playing basketball in their own driveway. I did it because," she paused, gathering courage, "because I let my prejudices cloud my judgment." A hush fell over the gathered crowd. Even the reporters seemed surprised by this candid admission. "For years, I've been the neighborhood watch leader," she continued. "But yesterday, I learned that I was watching for the wrong things. I wasn't protecting our neighborhood. I was damaging it." The chief's youngest child slipped past his mother and ran down to stand beside Mrs. Wu, reaching for her hand. She looked down, startled, then smiled tearfully. "This child," she gestured to the boy holding her hand, "offered to teach me basketball yesterday when I deserved nothing but scorn. And his father, our new police chief, showed me kindness when I had shown none to his family." The cameras clicked and whirred, capturing every moment. The chief stepped forward, placing a supportive hand on Mrs. Wu's shoulder. "We all have moments where we can choose to grow," he said to the reporters. "This isn't just about one incident or one neighborhood. It's about the choices we make every day." Just then, the elderly gentleman from yesterday emerged from his house, carrying a basketball. He walked over to join them, followed by other neighbors, one by one. Soon, the Lee's front lawn was filled with people. "We're not just here to talk about change," the elderly man announced. "We're here to make it happen. Starting with our first community basketball game, right now." The reporters watched in amazement as neighbors began setting up chairs and drinks. Someone brought out a portable speaker, playing upbeat music. The kids started warming up on the driveway. "But what about your neighborhood watch program?" one reporter asked Mrs. Wu. She smiled, looking more relaxed than anyone had ever seen her. "Oh, we're still watching the neighborhood," she replied. "We're just watching out for each other now, not watching out against each other. There's a big difference." The chief gathered everyone around. "Today's teams will be mixed. Kids, adults, neighbors who've never spoken to each other before. Because that's how we build community, one game at a time." The reporters stayed to capture something they hadn't expected. A story of real transformation. They filmed as Mrs. Wu, still in her morning robe, attempted her first three-pointer and missed spectacularly, laughing harder than anyone else. They watched as children taught adults the proper stance for shooting, and as neighbors who'd lived next to each other for years finally learned each other's names. As the morning wore on, More people from surrounding streets began to show up, drawn by the laughter and music. The story was no longer just about one incident. It had become about something much bigger, a community learning to see itself in a new light. But the most significant changes were still to come, because sometimes the smallest moments can spark the biggest transformations. Two police cars pulled up slowly to the curb, their lights off. Mrs. Wu stood with her arms crossed, tapping her foot impatiently as Officers Thompson and Rodriguez stepped out. She rushed toward them, pointing dramatically at the children who were still casually shooting hoops. Finally, "I've been waiting for someone to do something about this situation," she declared, loud enough for the whole street to hear. "These children have been causing chaos in our peaceful neighborhood all afternoon." Officer Thompson glanced at the kids, then back at Mrs. Wu, trying to keep a straight face. He'd been at the station meeting that morning when the new police chief had shown his family photos. Officer Rodriguez bit his lip, clearly fighting back a smile. "Ma'am, could you explain exactly what these children are doing wrong?" Officer Rodriguez asked professionally, pulling out his notepad. Mrs. Wu launched into her complaints, her voice getting higher with each word. "They're playing basketball in broad daylight. The noise is unbearable. All this bouncing and laughing. And look at how many of them there are. They must be up to something. This isn't the kind of neighborhood where people just—" She waved her hands around, searching for words. "Play basketball." Officer Thompson finished for her, raising an eyebrow. By now, several neighbors had gathered closer, pretending to check their mail or trim their already perfect bushes. The Lee children and their cousins had stopped playing, standing together near their hoop, trying not to laugh. "And how do we know they even belong here?" Mrs. Wu continued, lowering her voice to a dramatic whisper. "I've never seen some of them before. They could be troublemakers from another neighborhood." Mrs. Lee stepped forward from her porch, the plate of cookies still in her hands. "These are our children and their cousins who are visiting us," she explained calmly. "They're playing basketball in our driveway on a Saturday afternoon." "Well, that's what you say," Mrs. Wu sniffed. "But do you have proof? Do you have papers showing you actually live here?" Officer Rodriguez couldn't help but smile now. "Ma'am, we can absolutely verify that this family belongs here. See?" Mrs. Wu turned triumphantly to the gathering crowd. "The police will sort this out. I demand to see their documentation right now." Just then, a third police car turned onto the street. Mrs. Wu clasped her hands together in delight, thinking more backup had arrived. The car parked in the Lee's driveway, and out stepped the police chief himself, still in his full uniform after finishing up some paperwork at the station. "Is there a problem here, officers?" he asked, walking up to join the group. The Lee children ran to give their dad quick hugs, then stood back, grinning widely. Mrs. Wu's face went through a remarkable series of expressions: confusion, shock, disbelief, and finally, horror. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. "Chief Lee," Officer Thompson nodded respectfully. "We were just responding to a call about your children and their cousins playing basketball." The chief looked around at the gathered crowd, his expression calm but firm. "I see. And what seems to be the problem with children playing basketball on their own driveway?" Mrs. Wu had turned an interesting shade of pale. The phone she'd been clutching like a weapon now hung limply at her side. The neighbors who had been watching from their lawns suddenly became very interested in their shoes. I didn't. I mean," Mrs. Wu stammered, taking a small step backward. "I didn't know." The tension in the air could be cut with a knife as Chief Lee stood there, his badge gleaming in the afternoon sun. The neighborhood had fallen so quiet you could hear the leaves rustling in the breeze. Mrs. Wu kept opening and closing her mouth like a goldfish, unable to form words. "Officers," the chief said calmly, "would you mind sharing what exactly was reported in this call?" Officer Thompson cleared his throat. "Yes, sir. We received a complaint about Oh, he glanced at his notepad. Suspicious children playing basketball and causing a disturbance. I see. The chief nodded, looking around at the gathered neighbors. And when you arrived, what did you find? 5 children playing basketball in their own driveway, sir, Officer Rodriguez replied, trying to hide a small smile. No disturbance noted. The chief turned to Mrs. Wu, who was now clutching her designer handbag like a shield. Mrs. Wu, I believe we met briefly yesterday when you brought over cookies but ran away before leaving them. I'm sorry, we didn't get to finish our conversation about the Neighborhood Watch program. A few neighbors snickered, quickly trying to hide their amusement behind their hands. Mrs. Wu's face had turned from pale to bright red. I was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe, she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. Safe from what, exactly? The chief asked, his voice gentle but firm. From children playing basketball. From families spending time together? Or perhaps from something else? The gathered crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some neighbors started to drift away, suddenly remembering urgent appointments or dinner preparations. You know, when I accepted the position as police chief in this city, he continued, I had high hopes for this neighborhood. My family chose this place because we believed it would be a good community to be part of. Was I wrong about that? Several neighbors shook their heads, looking ashamed. One elderly gentleman stepped forward from the crowd. No, sir, you weren't wrong, he said firmly. I've lived here for 40 years, and I, for one, am glad to have your family as neighbors. My grandkids would love to join in a basketball game sometime, if that's okay with your children. The chief's kids brightened at this, nodding enthusiastically. Their cousins, who had been watching everything unfold, finally let out the giggles they'd been holding in. Mrs. Lee stepped forward with her plate of cookies. Why don't we all take a moment to actually meet each other? These cookies are still warm, and I made plenty for everyone. The atmosphere began to shift. A few neighbors who had started to leave turned back around. Someone called out, I'll bring some lemonade. Another voice added, I've got some chairs we can set up. Mrs. Wu stood frozen, watching as the very neighbors she'd rallied for her cause now gathered around the Lee family, introducing themselves properly for the first time. The officers, taking their cue from the chief, stayed to help set up chairs that neighbors had started bringing over. Mrs. Wu, the chief said, turning back to her, would you like to join us? I think we all had a lot we could learn from each other. Her eyes darted around, possibly looking for an escape route, but then something unexpected happened. The chief's youngest child walked up to her, holding out a basketball. Do you know how to play? He asked innocently. I could teach you. I'm really good at free throws now. The sincerity in the child's voice seemed to crack something in Mrs. Wu's carefully maintained facade. Her shoulders slumped slightly, and for the first time, a genuine, if small, smile appeared on her face. I haven't played since I was a little girl, she admitted quietly. Well, the chief smiled. Today seems like a perfect day to start again, doesn't it? As the afternoon sun began to soften, the sound of laughter, bouncing basketballs, and friendly conversation filled the street. But this was just the beginning of a much bigger change in the neighborhood. One that would start with a simple game of basketball. As neighbors gathered around the driveway sharing cookies and lemonade, the chief cleared his throat. Everyone fell silent, sensing an important moment was about to unfold. Since we're all here, he began, his voice carrying across the now quiet street, I'd like to take a moment to talk about why this afternoon's events hit close to home for me. The children stopped their basketball game, coming closer to listen. Mrs. Wu, who had just attempted and missed her first free throw in decades, stood awkwardly at the edge of the group. 25 years ago, the chief continued, I was one of those suspicious kids playing basketball in my driveway. My neighbors called the police on my family 5 times in our first month. Just for existing, just for living our lives. A heavy silence fell over the crowd. Several neighbors looked down at their feet, while others exchanged uncomfortable glances. But here's what's different today, he said, a small smile forming. Today, I'm not that scared kid anymore. I'm the chief of police, and that gives me a unique opportunity to address these issues from both sides. He turned to face Mrs. Wu directly, but his words were meant for everyone. When you called the police today, what exactly were you hoping would happen to these children? To my children. Mrs. Wu's hands trembled as she held the basketball. I didn't think, she started, then stopped, really considering her actions for perhaps the first time. That's just it, the chief said gently. We often don't think about the impact of our actions. We don't consider how calling the police on children playing basketball might affect them for the rest of their lives. One of the twins stepped forward. Dad, remember when you told us about your childhood basketball team? The one where you had to practice in the park because none of the neighbors would let us use their driveways, the chief finished, nodding. Yes, I remember. And look at us now. He gestured to the diverse group gathered in his driveway. Kids and adults of different backgrounds, uniformed officers chatting with neighbors, everyone sharing snacks and stories. This right here, he said, this is what community looks like. Not calling the police on children. Not assuming the worst about your neighbors. But this, people coming together, talking, understanding each other. An elderly woman who'd been quietly observing spoke up. Chief, I've lived here for 30 years, and I'm ashamed to say I've been part of the problem. But I'd like to be part of the solution now. How can we do better? The chief's face brightened. That's exactly the right question to ask. And I have some ideas, starting with revamping our neighborhood watch program to focus on building bridges instead of walls. Mrs. Wu, who had been the neighborhood watch leader, suddenly looked interested despite herself. What? What kind of changes? Well, the chief smiled. For starters, how about we organize a weekly community basketball game? All ages, all skill levels welcome. Officers included. The suggestion was met with enthusiastic nods and chuckles, especially from the kids. Officer Thompson immediately called out, "Dibs on the first game." And, the chief continued, maybe we could use our monthly watch meetings to actually get to know each other instead of just reporting on each other. Share meals, share stories, share our lives. As he spoke, something remarkable was happening. People who had lived as strangers for years were exchanging phone numbers. Kids were making plans for future basketball games. Even Mrs. Wu was slowly beginning to look less like someone who'd swallowed a lemon and more like someone who might be willing to learn. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the driveway as the impromptu gathering continued. The chief watched as his youngest child taught Mrs. Wu the proper way to hold a basketball, her designer workout clothes finally getting their first real workout. This wasn't just a neighborhood gathering anymore. It was the beginning of real change. But the story wasn't over yet, because sometimes the biggest transformations take time, and the most important lessons come from unexpected places. 1 month had passed since the basketball incident, and the neighborhood had transformed in ways nobody could have predicted. The local community center was packed on this sunny Saturday morning, with people spilling out into the parking lot. The chief stood at a podium, looking out at the diverse crowd gathered for the first Unity in Community workshop. Mrs. Wu sat in the front row, no longer the self-appointed neighborhood watchdog, but now the enthusiastic co-organizer of the event. A month ago, the chief began, a game of basketball turned into a wake-up call for our community. Today, we're here to make sure the call didn't go unanswered. Behind him, a large screen showed photos from the past month. Kids teaching adults basketball, neighbors sharing meals, and the now famous video of Mrs. Wu scoring her first basket, after about 50 attempts, while everyone cheered. But something even more remarkable happened, he continued. Other neighborhoods started calling. They wanted to know how we did it. How did we turn a moment of conflict into a movement of change? Mrs. Wu stood up, smoothing down her casual clothes. She'd finally retired those unused designer workout outfits. That's why we're all here today, she added. To share what we've learned and to keep learning from each other. The crowd buzzed with energy as people broke into small groups. Police officers sat with residents, sharing stories and discussing how to build trust. Kids led workshops on how to not judge a book by its cover, using their own experiences to teach adults about acceptance. In one corner, the chief's twins were helping run a basketball basics clinic. Their students included several elderly neighbors who'd never touched a basketball before, along with some of the very people who'd once called the police on children playing. Remember last week, one elderly woman chuckled, dribbling carefully, when we had that noise complaint about the Johnsons' birthday party. Instead of calling the police, we all ended up joining the celebration. The chief's wife, watching from nearby, smiled at the memory. The complaint had turned into an impromptu block party with 3 different families contributing their cultural dishes to the celebration. Outside in the parking lot, Officer Thompson had set up a coffee with a cop station. But instead of the usual formal setup, he was teaching kids how to make paper airplanes while their parents chatted with other officers about community concerns. "Chief," a reporter called out, making her way through the crowd. "Your community's story has gone viral. People are calling it the basketball revolution. What do you say to that?" The chief smiled, watching as Mrs. Wu patiently taught a group of newcomers the proper way to hold a basketball, just as his son had taught her weeks ago. "This isn't a revolution," he replied. "It's a return to what community should have been all along. We're not changing who we are. We're remembering who we were meant to be." Just then, a commotion arose from the basketball court. Everyone turned to look as cheers erupted. Mrs. Wu had just made a 3-pointer, her first ever. She stood there in shock for a moment before breaking into the biggest smile anyone had ever seen on her face. "Now that," the chief laughed, "is what progress looks like." The workshop continued throughout the day, but it wasn't just about lectures and lessons. People shared meals together, played games, and most importantly talked. Really talked. About their fears, their hopes, their mistakes, and their dreams for their community. As the sun began to set, nobody wanted to leave. Kids were still playing basketball with their new friends. Adults were exchanging phone numbers and making plans for dinner parties. Officers were being invited to family barbecues. The chief's youngest son tugged on his sleeve. "Dad," he whispered, "is this what you meant when you said sometimes good things come from bad things?" The chief looked around at the scene before him. Former adversaries now friends, strangers now neighbors, fear transformed into fellowship. But this wasn't the end of the story. In fact, something even more unexpected was about to happen, something that would take their little community's message far beyond their neighborhood streets. 6 months after the basketball incident, the local news crews were back in the neighborhood. This time, they weren't covering a conflict. They were documenting a celebration. The entire street had been transformed into a festival space. Colorful banners hung between houses, reading Community Unity Day. Tables lined the sidewalks, loaded with dishes from every culture represented in the neighborhood. The smell of grilled food and the sound of music filled the air. In the center of it all, the basketball hoop that started everything stood as a symbol of change. Someone had decorated it with flowers and ribbons, and a small plaque beneath it read, "Where change began, one game at a time." The chief stood on his driveway, now wearing casual clothes instead of his uniform, surrounded by children teaching younger kids how to shoot hoops. Mrs. Wu was beside him, wearing a t-shirt that said, "Community Coach," a far cry from her former self. "If you had told me 6 months ago that I'd be standing here today," Mrs. Wu spoke to the news camera, "organizing a community celebration with the very family I once called the police on, I wouldn't have believed you. But look at us now." The camera panned to show officers playing basketball with kids, neighbors sharing food and stories, and most remarkably, people from other neighborhoods who had come to learn from their example. "We've had visitors from 30 different communities, the chief explained to the reporter. They all want to know our secret, but there really isn't one. We just learn to see each other as people first. His youngest son interrupted, tugging on his sleeve. Dad, the mayor's here. Sure enough, the mayor had arrived, not in a formal suit, but wearing jeans and carrying a basketball. She walked over to the chief and Mrs. Wu, smiling broadly. I had to come see this for myself, she said, looking around at the festivities. Your neighborhood's program is becoming a model for the entire city. We'd like to implement it everywhere. The chief's wife appeared with a plate of cookies, the same recipe she tried to share on that first day. Would you like to hear how it all started? She asked the mayor. Actually, Mrs. Wu stepped forward. I should tell that part. It's important to own our mistakes if we want to help others learn from them. As Mrs. Wu shared their story, more people gathered to listen. Even the kids paused their game, sitting cross-legged on the driveway. They'd heard the story before, but it never got old. The real change, Mrs. Wu concluded, wasn't just in our actions. It was in our hearts. We stopped seeing differences as threats and started seeing them as opportunities to learn from each other. The mayor nodded thoughtfully, then picked up a basketball. Well, I hear there's a tradition here of learning through basketball. Who's willing to teach me? The chief's twins rushed forward, eager to help. Soon, the mayor was attempting her first shot, surrounded by cheering neighbors. The ball missed completely, but nobody cared. They were too busy celebrating the attempt. As the sun began to set on their celebration, the chief gathered everyone for a group photo. Hundreds of people squeezed together, residents, police officers, visitors, and the mayor, all smiling beneath the basketball hoop that had started it all. You know what's amazing? Mrs. Wu said quietly to the chief. That call I made to the police 6 months ago. It was probably the best mistake I ever made. Why's that? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Because sometimes, she smiled, watching as her former suspicious kids taught the mayor the proper shooting stance. The things we fear the most turn out to be the greatest gifts we could receive. The story of their neighborhood spread far beyond their city. News outlets picked it up. Other communities adopted their program, and slowly but surely, change began to ripple outward. But the real miracle wasn't in the big changes. It was in the small ones. In the daily choices to be kind, to learn, to grow, and to see each other as neighbors first. The basketball hoop still stands in the Lee's driveway, no longer just a piece of sports equipment, but a reminder that change can start anywhere, with anyone, at any time. All it takes is the courage to look past our fears and see the humanity in each other.